Humanity's existence on the galactic stage had been anything but pleasant. For generations, the Trivaxian Empire loomed over Earth's people, treating them as nothing more than a lesser species, a source of labor, resources, and entertainment. At first, humanity had accepted their place, believing the Trivaxians' claims that resistance was futile. After all, the Trivaxians possessed technology so advanced it seemed almost magical. Their fleets could blot out the stars, their weapons could level cities in a single blast, and their armor rendered them impervious to conventional human armaments. But humanity had one thing the Trivaxians underestimated: resilience. Decades under the Trivaxian thumb had transformed Earth's population. The once fractured nations of the planet united under the pressure of shared oppression. Borders became meaningless as all of humanity recognized a common enemy. Scientists worked tirelessly, reverse engineering scraps of alien technology that the Trivaxians left behind or abandoned. Engineers, mechanics, and even hobbyist tinkerers pooled their knowledge to develop makeshift solutions to humanity's many disadvantages. Yet for every small victory, the Trivaxians inflicted immense losses. Entire cities were razed as warnings. Human leaders who showed defiance were publicly executed in grand displays meant to break the human spirit. Trivaxian scientists conducted experiments on human captives, treating them as little more than lab animals. The galaxy watched and did nothing, either cowed by the Trivaxians' power or indifferent to the plight of an inferior species. But humanity's anger simmered beneath the surface. And then it boiled over. It started with the obliteration of New Horizon, a colony on the far edge of the Sol system. New Horizon was a symbol of hope, Earth's first attempt at building a new home among the stars. Its destruction wasn't a tactical move, it was a message. The Trivaxian overseer in charge of the Sol sector deemed humanity's ambition inappropriate and decided to erase it. Without warning, Trivaxian warships descended on New Horizon. Buildings crumbled under plasma bombardment. Families perished in a storm of fire. A once thriving colony was reduced to ash. The galaxy barely took notice. To most, it was just another example of the Trivaxians reminding a minor species of their place. But to humanity, it was the final straw. In the following weeks, the surviving leaders of Earth convened in secret. They'd heard whispers of resistance before, pockets of fighters, isolated sabotage missions, lone pilots who had managed to down a Trivaxian scout ship. But this time, the movement gained real momentum. Human scientists presented blueprints for weapons based on captured Trivaxian technology. Engineers revealed the prototype of a stealth ship capable of evading Trivaxian sensors. And perhaps most importantly, new leaders emerged. Among them was Mark, a former military commander who had lost his family in the New Horizon massacre. Mark was practical, level-headed, and determined. He knew they couldn't fight the Trivaxians head-on. Instead, he proposed a different approach: guerrilla warfare. Small, nimble teams would strike at critical Trivaxian facilities, steal their technology, and vanish before the enemy could retaliate. Every successful operation would not only weaken the Trivaxians but also prove to humanity, and the galaxy, that resistance was possible. Meanwhile, other members of the resistance focused on spreading the message. Underground media networks broadcasted news of Trivaxian atrocities and the bravery of human fighters. Hidden communication channels allowed civilians to share intelligence, distribute resources, and coordinate their actions. The resistance was no longer just a scattered group of rebels. It was becoming a movement. However, not everyone was convinced. Many feared that open defiance would bring even harsher reprisals. What if the Trivaxians decided to destroy Earth itself? These doubts lingered until the day of the Green Ridge incident. Green Ridge was a small mining outpost on the far side of Earth's moon. Its workers were primarily civilians, scientists, engineers, and laborers extracting rare minerals to meet Trivaxian quotas. One day, a Trivaxian commander arrived at Green Ridge, demanding an increase in production. The overseer, a human who had spent years appeasing the Trivaxians, attempted to negotiate. In response, the Trivaxians slaughtered the entire outpost. The massacre was a turning point. It showed that no amount of compliance would ever satisfy the Trivaxians. Humanity's survival depended on resistance. And for the first time, even the most cautious voices joined the call to action. Mark and his team wasted no time. Using the stolen schematics, they built their first stealth corvette. It wasn't pretty, more a patchwork of human ingenuity and scavenged Trivaxian parts than a proper spacecraft. But it was effective. The ship, nicknamed Shadow 1, could slip past Trivaxian patrols undetected. It was the first tangible sign that humanity could level the playing field. In their first mission, Mark's team targeted a Trivaxian depot orbiting a distant moon. The depot stored weapons, supplies, and data cores. The plan was simple: infiltrate, sabotage, and escape. Yet when the team reached the depot, they discovered something far more valuable. Hidden among the supply caches was a prototype Trivaxian command module, a device capable of controlling multiple Trivaxian fleets remotely. If humanity could crack its encryption, they could learn the Trivaxians' fleet movements, their supply routes, even their vulnerabilities. The operation shifted from a raid to a recovery mission. Under the cover of Shadow 1's cloaking field, the team loaded the command module onto their ship. They planted charges to destroy the remaining supplies and slipped away just as Trivaxian reinforcements arrived. When the depot exploded, it wasn't just a tactical victory. It was a statement. Humanity wasn't just surviving. It was fighting back. As the Resistance reviewed the command module's data, it became clear that the Trivaxians weren't as invincible as they seemed. Their empire relied on a complex web of logistics and communications. Disrupting that network could cripple their ability to respond effectively. Mark stood before his team, holding a tablet displaying the recovered data. "This is just the beginning," he said. "They've kept us down for too long. It's time we showed them what humanity is really made of." Across the galaxy, the ripple effects of humanity's defiance began to spread. Other species, long silent under Trivaxian rule, started to pay attention. If humans, one of the lesser species, could resist, maybe they could too. The Trivaxians might have seen humanity as insignificant, but they had made one critical mistake: they underestimated what happens when people have nothing left to lose. Mark stood on the bridge of Shadow 1, staring at the stars that stretched out before him. The command module they had recovered from the Trivaxian depot was a game-changer. He could feel the weight of it in his hands as he handed it off to their tech crew for analysis. If they could decipher its contents, they might gain a crucial edge against the Trivaxians, an advantage that could turn a scattered resistance into a force that even the galaxy's overlords would have to reckon with. The air inside the ship buzzed with energy as the crew worked. Engineers crowded around workstations, monitoring streams of alien code that scrolled across their screens. The module was encrypted, of course, but humanity's greatest minds had grown adept at cracking Trivaxian security. They had to be. Survival demanded it. Days turned into weeks as the Resistance dug through layers of encryption. During that time, Shadow 1 and other Resistance ships carried out smaller raids, hitting lightly defended supply lines and depots. These skirmishes kept the Trivaxians off balance, forcing them to spread their forces thin. But Mark and his team knew these missions were just the opening act. The real battle would begin when they unlocked the secrets of the command module. Finally, the breakthrough came. A young analyst named Lila, who had once been a humble computer technician on Earth, had managed to bypass the module's most stubborn security layer. The crew gathered in the briefing room as the data was projected onto a screen. What they saw made their jaws drop. The module contained detailed information about Trivaxian fleet deployments, supply chains, and outposts. It also revealed something far more valuable: an experimental Trivaxian weapon under development at a hidden facility. The weapon, if completed, could unleash destruction on an unimaginable scale, wiping out entire planets with a single shot. And yet, the module also contained notes on the project's vulnerabilities. If the Resistance could act quickly, they might not only neutralize the threat but also deal a crippling blow to the Trivaxian war machine. Mark leaned forward, his face grim. This is it. This is our chance to make them bleed. If we hit that facility before they finish the weapon, we can turn the tide. The room erupted into focused discussion. Tactical experts planned the attack while the tech crew worked on forging access codes to bypass the facility's defenses. Fighters and support personnel prepared for a mission that could mean the difference between survival and extinction. For the first time in a long while, the Resistance felt a glimmer of hope. When the day of the operation arrived, Shadow 1 led a small strike force. The target was deep within Trivaxian-controlled space, hidden beneath the surface of a barren moon. The facility was heavily guarded, its location shielded by advanced cloaking technology. But the module's data provided a way in, a narrow window of opportunity to slip through the defenses before the Trivaxians could react. The journey to the target was tense. Shadow 1's crew knew they were venturing into the heart of the beast. Every ping on the radar, every flicker of light in the distance, could signal an ambush. Yet, they pressed on. Mark's voice over the comms kept the team focused, his calm demeanor a steadying force as the tension mounted. As they neared the facility, the crew switched to silent running. Shadow 1's cloaking system hummed faintly, blending the ship into the void. They drifted past massive Trivaxian patrol ships, each one bristling with weapons. The Resistance fighters held their breath, knowing that even a single misstep could spell disaster. But the plan held. They slipped through the Trivaxian net unseen. Inside the facility, the Trivaxians were unaware of the approaching danger. Scientists and engineers moved about their tasks, fine-tuning the experimental weapon. Guards patrolled the corridors, their movements precise but routine. The Trivaxians were confident in their security. They had no reason to expect that a group of humans, a species they deemed inferior, could infiltrate their most secret installation. Mark and his team breached the outer defenses, using the forged codes to disable the first layer of security. They moved quickly, each step calculated to avoid detection. The interior of the facility was a stark contrast to the barren moon outside. Sleek corridors lined with alien symbols led to massive laboratories filled with exotic machinery. The air was cold and sterile, carrying the faint hum of advanced technology. As the team moved deeper, they encountered their first patrol. A Trivaxian squad marched in perfect formation, their imposing figures clad in gleaming armor. The humans held their position, waiting for the perfect moment. When the patrol passed, Mark signaled for his team to advance. They continued their infiltration, bypassing traps and neutralizing cameras along the way. Eventually, they reached the central chamber where the weapon was housed. The room was vast, dominated by a massive cannon-like structure that pulsed with a faint blue light. It was a terrible sight, a machine designed for one purpose, destruction. Around it, Trivaxian scientists monitored consoles, unaware of the human team crouched in the shadows. Mark gave the order, and the Resistance fighters struck. Stun grenades filled the chamber with blinding flashes, disorienting the Trivaxians. The humans moved with precision, taking out guards before they could sound the alarm. The scientists fled, leaving their workstations behind. Lila and the tech crew rushed to the weapon's control system. They inserted data spikes, devices that would corrupt the weapon's core programming, rendering it inoperable. Meanwhile, Mark and the fighters set explosives around the room. If they couldn't disable the weapon entirely, they would make sure it was never completed. As the team worked, the facility's security finally caught on. Alarms blared, and reinforcements began converging on their position. Mark's voice was calm but firm. Finish the job and get out. We'll cover you. The resistance fighters held the line, engaging Trivaxian troops in the corridors leading to the chamber. The fighting was fierce. Trivaxians had superior firepower, but the humans fought with desperate determination. Every second the team held their ground was another second for the tech crew to complete their sabotage. When the data spikes finished their work, Lila called out, "It's done. We've disabled the weapons targeting system." Mark nodded. Time to go. The resistance fighters fell back, detonating charges behind them to slow the Trivaxians' pursuit. The retreat was chaotic, but they stuck to their plan. Shadow 1 and the other ships were waiting just outside the facility's atmosphere, cloaked and ready for extraction. As the team reached the rendezvous point, they saw a flash in the distance. The charges they had planted around the weapon detonated, ensuring it would never be used. The sight brought a rare moment of relief. They had struck a blow that the Trivaxians would feel. Shadow 1's crew made it back to the ship, battered but victorious. The mission had come at a cost, some injuries, some close calls, but the result was undeniable. The resistance had done what was once thought impossible. They had infiltrated one of the most secure Trivaxian installations and emerged victorious. Mark stood on the bridge, looking out at the stars once more. The Trivaxians had always considered humans weak and insignificant. But this mission proved otherwise. Humanity wasn't just fighting back, they were winning. And this was only the beginning. The mission to disable the Trivaxian superweapon had ignited a spark across the resistance. It wasn't just a tactical win, it was proof that humanity's rebellion was no longer a faint ember struggling to stay lit. News of the raid spread rapidly, even into sectors the resistance had yet to reach. Humanity, once dismissed as a scattered, outmatched underdog, now commanded attention from other species, some of whom had been oppressed by the Trivaxians for generations. Mark found himself at the center of this growing storm. Meetings aboard Shadow 1 turned from planning small, desperate strikes into discussions about coordinated campaigns across multiple systems. Resistance cells that had once operated independently now sought to join forces. Even a few alien groups, formerly enslaved or subjugated by the Trivaxians, began to reach out, cautiously at first, but soon with more confidence. The galaxy's downtrodden were starting to believe that if humanity could fight back, maybe they could too. While these developments brought hope, they also brought challenges. The resistance had to adapt quickly, scaling up operations and improving communication. Their ships, once barely functional cobbled-together vessels, were gradually becoming more reliable as engineers and technicians pooled their knowledge. Supply lines were established in secret, hidden within asteroid belts and beneath unassuming colony outposts. Yet, despite these improvements, the Trivaxians weren't idle. They were rallying their forces, and retaliation was inevitable. Mark and his team knew that their next move had to be bold. Disabling the superweapon had thrown the Trivaxians off balance, but it wouldn't keep them there forever. They needed to strike again before their enemies could recover, this time targeting something that would truly shatter the Trivaxians' aura of invincibility. That something, as it turned out, was a fleet command hub orbiting the planet Zalur 3, a massive station where Trivaxian admirals coordinated their military campaigns across the entire sector. The Zalur 3 command hub was a linchpin in the Trivaxian Empire's control over the region. From this station, orders were dispatched to fleets, reinforcements were allocated, and intelligence was analyzed. If the resistance could disable it, even temporarily, it would throw the Trivaxian forces into disarray. Furthermore, capturing data from the hub would provide invaluable insight into their operations and, perhaps, uncover more weaknesses. The operation would be their most complex and dangerous yet. The command hub was heavily defended by fleets, automated turrets, and elite security teams. On top of that, the station's core systems were encrypted with top-tier Trivaxian security protocols. To succeed, the Resistance would need not just a stealthy infiltration team but also a coordinated assault to draw the defenders away, giving Shadow 1 and its infiltration unit a chance to breach the station's interior. The plan was laid out in detail. Resistance cells from neighboring sectors would launch diversionary strikes on Trivaxian outposts and supply convoys, forcing the Empire to spread their resources thin. Meanwhile, Shadow 1 and a small, elite squad would approach Zalor 3 under cover of an experimental cloaking system recently developed by human scientists. The goal was simple in concept but complex in execution: gain entry, copy the station's central data core, and plant a series of timed explosives to disable the hub's critical systems. Then, get out before the full weight of the Trivaxian fleet descended upon them. As the Resistance's leadership finalized the operation, Mark found a moment of quiet on Shadow 1's observation deck. Staring out at the stars, he reflected on how far they'd come. A year ago, he couldn't have imagined humanity challenging the Trivaxians on this scale. Yet here they were, planning an assault on one of the most heavily fortified installations in the galaxy. He knew the risks, but he also knew the stakes. If they succeeded, it wouldn't just be another victory. It would be a turning point. The day of the operation arrived, and the galaxy seemed to hold its breath. Resistance forces launched their diversionary attacks as planned. Reports came in of skirmishes and raids that stretched the Trivaxians' response capacity. Meanwhile, Shadow 1 and its infiltration team slipped through the chaos, approaching Zalor 3 with calculated precision. The station loomed ahead, a massive construct of steel and light, its outer edges bristling with weapons. For a moment, the team aboard Shadow 1 was silent. Then Mark gave the order, and the cloaked ship began its final approach. Docking with the station was no easy feat. Trivaxian security protocols were designed to detect any unauthorized vessel. But the Resistance's tech crew had worked tirelessly to create a false signature, a digital mask that allowed Shadow 1 to slip through the station's perimeter scanners. When the ship latched onto an auxiliary airlock, the infiltration team moved swiftly. They donned stealth suits and activated jamming devices to disrupt internal sensors. Inside the station, the air was cold and sterile. Trivaxian personnel moved about their duties, unaware of the human team that now crept through their halls. The team relied on their knowledge of the station's layout, extracted from the command module during their previous mission. Their target was the central data core, located deep within the station's command sector. As they navigated the corridors, the team encountered the expected challenges: patrolling guards, automated sentry drones, and security checkpoints. Each obstacle was met with carefully planned responses. They used EMP devices to disable drones, forged clearance codes to pass through checkpoints, and non-lethal takedowns to subdue guards. Mark led the way, his every move calculated and purposeful. This wasn't just a mission, it was a test of everything the Resistance had learned. When they reached the central data core chamber, the team moved quickly. The core was a towering construct, glowing with the energy of countless data streams flowing through it. Lila, the team's lead technician, went to work extracting the information. Her hands flew over the controls, her mind racing to bypass the remaining encryption layers. The data they retrieved would be priceless: fleet movements, supply chain routes, key strategic installations. But they couldn't linger. Every second increased the risk of detection. As the download neared completion, an alarm sounded. The team's presence had been detected. Mark immediately ordered the explosives to be planted. They couldn't leave the station intact. Even if they had the data, the hub's operational systems needed to be taken offline. Resistance fighters moved quickly, attaching charges to the station's power conduits and communication relays. Trivaxian guards swarmed the area, and the team found themselves in a running firefight. The corridors turned into a chaotic maze of plasma bolts and shouted commands. Shadow 1's extraction team kept the ship ready and cloaked just outside the station, monitoring the team's progress. Mark barked orders over the comms, directing the squad to fallback points and ensuring that Lila and the data stayed protected. At last, the charges were set, and the team began their retreat. The station shook as the explosives detonated, plunging sections of the hub into darkness and severing communication links. The data core's system sputtered, and the lights flickered. The team fought their way to the airlock, using every ounce of their training and determination to hold off the pursuing Trivaxians. When they reached the ship, the extraction was seamless. Shadow One's engines roared to life, and the cloaking system activated once more. They slipped away into the void, leaving the crippled station behind. As the team regrouped on the bridge, Lila handed Mark a data pad. "We got it," she said, her voice a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. The pad displayed rows of Trivaxian fleet data, each line representing a potential opportunity to strike. Mark nodded, knowing this information would be a cornerstone of their next phase. The mission had been costly, but it had also been a resounding success. Back at the Resistance's hidden base, the news spread like wildfire. Humanity's forces had struck another devastating blow. The galaxy watched in shock and disbelief as the once untouchable Trivaxian command hub now floated in ruins. Other oppressed species began to rally to humanity's cause, their own rebellions sparked by the courage and resilience of a people who refused to stay down. Mark stood before a gathered crowd of fighters, technicians, and new allies. "They thought we were weak," he said, his voice steady and clear. "They thought we wouldn't fight back. But look around you. We're not just fighting. We're winning." And for the first time, the galaxy's mightiest empire felt the tremors of a resistance that would not be silenced. Word of the Resistance's victory at Zalor 3 swept across the galaxy, and the Trivaxians' iron grip on the sector began to loosen. It wasn't just the loss of a command hub that struck fear into their hearts, it was what it represented. For the first time in generations, the galaxy saw a glimpse of hope that the mighty Trivaxian Empire could be challenged. And it was humans, the species so often dismissed as insignificant, leading the charge. Mark and his team returned to a hero's welcome at one of the Resistance's hidden bases. The base itself was a marvel of human ingenuity. Carved into a hollowed-out asteroid, it bristled with defense systems and state-of-the-art communication relays. Engineers worked tirelessly to maintain and upgrade the ships that came and went, while Resistance fighters trained in mock combat arenas to prepare for the battles ahead. In the weeks following the raid, the Resistance leadership pored over the data recovered from the command hub. The files revealed detailed fleet movements, production schedules for key Trivaxian warships, and even a list of facilities where the Empire's most advanced technologies were being developed. It was a treasure trove of intelligence, and humanity wasted no time putting it to use. One file in particular caught their attention, a Trivaxian communication log referring to a propaganda campaign aimed at quelling unrest on occupied worlds. The Trivaxians relied heavily on fear to maintain control, broadcasting messages of their invincibility and the futility of resistance. But now, with the loss of the Zalor 3 hub, their narrative was crumbling. The Resistance saw an opportunity to flip the script. A bold plan began to take shape. Mark, along with Lila and a few others, proposed hijacking the Trivaxians' own communication network. If they could gain access to the Empire's broadcasting systems, they could send a message directly to every world under Trivaxian rule. It would be a declaration that the Resistance was not only alive but thriving, and that the time had come for the oppressed species of the galaxy to rise up. The plan was ambitious. The Trivaxian Central Broadcasting Station, located on the heavily fortified planet Rhinoa Prime, was the heart of their propaganda machine. It was protected by multiple layers of defenses, orbital platforms, ground-based anti-aircraft batteries, and an entire garrison of elite troops. But it also presented a unique opportunity. If the Resistance could reach the station's control room and upload their own transmission, it would spread across every corner of the galaxy faster than the Trivaxians could shut it down. The Resistance assembled a strike team of their best operatives. Mark would lead the infiltration, while Lila handled the technical side of the operation. Shadow 1, still one of their most advanced stealth ships, would carry them to Rinoa Prime under cloak. Other resistance cells would launch diversionary attacks in nearby systems to pull Trivaxian forces away from the planet, buying time for the infiltration team to complete their mission. When the day of the operation arrived, the team was ready. Shadow 1 glided through the void, its cloaking field rendering it invisible to enemy scanners. Inside the ship, the atmosphere was tense but focused. Mark stood in the center of the briefing room, going over the final details. The team knew what was at stake. If they succeeded, their message could spark revolts across dozens of worlds. If they failed, it would be a devastating setback. As they approached Rinoa Prime, the planet's defenses came into view. The orbital platforms bristled with cannons, their gunmetal surfaces glinting in the distant starlight. The team relied on precise timing and their cloaking system to slip past the outer patrols. Once within the atmosphere, Shadow 1 descended silently toward the surface, landing in a secluded ravine outside the main city. From there, the team set out on foot, carrying lightweight infiltration gear and carefully concealed weapons. The city surrounding the broadcasting station was a stark reminder of Trivaxian dominance. Towering spires of alien architecture loomed overhead, their surfaces etched with the Empire's sigils. Trivaxian troops patrolled the streets, their imposing forms casting long shadows under the city's artificial lights. Citizens of various species moved through the streets, their expressions weary and their movements subdued. It was clear that fear hung heavy in the air. Mark and his team navigated the city carefully, avoiding patrols and blending into the crowd when necessary. They had studied the station's layout extensively. The main entrance was too heavily guarded, so they took a more discreet route, an old maintenance tunnel that led beneath the building. The tunnel was cramped and dark, but it brought them close to the station's control room without drawing attention. When they emerged inside the building, the team moved quickly. They neutralized a pair of guards with tranquilizers before they could sound the alarm. Lila worked her magic on the station's internal security systems, using a portable device to loop the camera feeds and disable door locks. Their target was the central control room, a massive chamber lined with towering computer banks and holographic displays. This was the nerve center of the Trivaxians' propaganda network. As the team approached, their progress slowed. The station's security force had become more alert, and patrols in the upper levels were more frequent. Mark led the team in short, precise movements, using distraction devices to draw guards away from their path. Each step forward brought them closer to their goal, and closer to discovery. Finally, they reached the control room. It was even more imposing than they'd imagined. The holographic displays projected glowing maps of Trivaxian-controlled space, and rows of alien technicians worked at their stations, oblivious to the human infiltrators. Mark signaled for the team to fan out. They moved silently, subduing the technicians one by one and securing the room. Lila rushed to the central console. This was the critical moment. She connected her portable hacking device and began the process of uploading the Resistance's message. The data transfer was agonizingly slow, each second feeling like an eternity. Meanwhile, Mark and the rest of the team held their positions, watching the doors and preparing for a fight. It was only a matter of time before someone noticed the disruption. Sure enough, an alarm blared throughout the station. Trivaxian guards stormed toward the control room, and the Resistance fighters met them head-on. Plasma bolts lit up the chamber as both sides exchanged fire. Mark's team held their ground, using the room's consoles and equipment for cover. The fighting was intense, but they knew they only had to hold out long enough for the upload to complete. Lila shouted over the noise. "It's almost done. Just a few more seconds." Mark barked orders, directing his team to concentrate their fire on the advancing guards. The room was filled with the deafening sounds of battle, but the Resistance fighters stayed focused. They knew that this moment, this single broadcast, could change the course of their struggle. Finally, Lila's device beeped. The upload was complete. She hit the final command, and the Resistance's message began broadcasting across the entire Trivaxian network. It would be seen on every occupied world, every colony, every outpost. The galaxy would hear humanity's defiance, and they would see the cracks in the Trivaxian Empire's facade. Message sent. Lila yelled. Mark gave the order to retreat. The team fought their way back through the station, using their remaining equipment to slow their pursuers. Shadow 1 was waiting for them, and as soon as they were aboard, the ship took off, its cloaking system reactivating to hide their escape. The broadcast had done its job. Across the galaxy, oppressed species watched in disbelief as the Resistance's message played on their screens. It wasn't just a call to arms, it was proof that the Trivaxians weren't invincible. Revolts began to stir in the farthest corners of the Empire. Rebellions that had been simmering in secret now boiled over, inspired by humanity's bold defiance. Back at the Resistance base, Mark and his team received updates from their allies. The galaxy was changing. The Trivaxians were scrambling to contain the unrest, their forces stretched thin and their control slipping. Humanity's resistance was no longer just a flicker of hope. It was a beacon. And the galaxy's downtrodden were answering its call. In the weeks that followed the broadcast, the galaxy erupted into a cacophony of rebellion. Human colonies and resistance cells weren't the only ones taking action now. Entire planets once cowed into submission by the Trivaxians began to rise up. The message from Rhinoa Prime had struck a chord, showing that even the most ruthless empire could bleed. For species who had endured generations of oppression, the realization was transformative. Trivaxian garrisons on outer planets found themselves surrounded by local uprisings. Supply lines that had remained secure for centuries were suddenly cut. Pirate factions that had once preyed on scattered fringe worlds now united with freedom fighters, coordinating strikes on key trade hubs. Even the Trivaxian homeworld began to feel the effects of the unrest. The Empire's leaders scrambled to maintain order, but the cracks were widening too quickly to repair. On the Resistance's side, Mark and his team barely had time to rest. They moved from one operation to the next, coordinating efforts between various factions. Their base of operations had grown into a bustling hub of activity. Ships came and went constantly, delivering supplies, intelligence, and fresh recruits. Engineers worked around the clock to upgrade weapons and ships, while tacticians devised ever more ambitious plans to keep the Trivaxians on the back foot. Shadow 1 had become a symbol of the Resistance's ingenuity. The ship's experimental cloaking device and advanced sensors allowed it to slip into places no other vessel could reach. Its successes became legendary, disabling a fleet's command carrier in orbit around Parvar 6, sabotaging a Trivaxian weapons facility on Gendur, and even stealing a prototype hyperdrive from a top-secret research lab. Each victory sent shockwaves through the Empire, emboldening resistance fighters and their allies. Mark, however, wasn't content with just disrupting the Trivaxians. He wanted to dismantle their power structure entirely. His next target was one of the most heavily guarded strongholds in the Empire, the Central Command Facility on Drakkar Prime. This planet wasn't just a military hub, it was where the Trivaxian High Command operated, issuing orders that rippled out to their entire galactic network. Taking Drakkar Prime would mean more than a victory, it would mean cutting the head off the snake. The operation would be unprecedented in scale. The Resistance no longer operated as a single, scrappy group. They had become a coalition of species and factions united by a shared goal. This coalition would provide the manpower and firepower needed for the assault on Drakkar Prime. While smaller resistance groups carried out diversionary attacks across Trivaxian space, the main fleet gathered at a hidden location to plan the strike. Mark worked closely with the coalition leaders. Some were human, but many represented alien species who had joined the cause after the broadcast. These leaders brought diverse perspectives and strategies to the table. Krayla, a fiery tactician from the Zoran species, proposed a multi-pronged attack that would keep Trivaxian defenses stretched thin. Varn, a former pirate captain turned resistance fighter, suggested using hit-and-run tactics to keep the Trivaxians off balance. Together, they refined their plans into a cohesive strategy. As the fleet prepared for the assault, Lila and the tech teams worked tirelessly to analyze the intelligence from the Zalor 3 raid and the Rhinoa Prime broadcast. They identified weaknesses in Drakkar Prime's defenses, outdated orbital turrets, a supply depot with a critical vulnerability, and an over-reliance on automated systems that could be hacked. The Resistance would exploit every single one. The final days before the attack were a whirlwind of activity. Ships were armed and fueled. Troops underwent last-minute training drills. Engineers double-checked every system to ensure there were no malfunctions. Mark spent those nights reviewing the plan again and again, knowing the stakes couldn't be higher. This wasn't just another raid. This was a battle that could define the future of the entire galaxy. When the day of the assault arrived, the fleet assembled in the shadow of a massive asteroid field, hidden from Trivaxian sensors. Hundreds of ships, ranging from nimble fighters to repurposed freighters, floated silently, waiting for the signal. Mark stood on the bridge of Shadow 1, gazing out at the armada. The human flagship, a heavily modified battleship called the Vanguard, took position at the fleet's center. Its massive cannons would provide the firepower needed to punch through Drakkar Prime's defenses. The operation began with a series of diversionary strikes. Smaller resistance groups attacked Trivaxian installations in nearby sectors, drawing attention away from Drakkar Prime. The Empire scrambled to respond, deploying ships to deal with the sudden uprisings. Meanwhile, the coalition fleet moved into position. As the fleet exited the asteroid field and approached Drakkar Prime, the Trivaxians finally realized what was happening. Alarms blared across the planet's orbital defenses. Warships launched from surface hangars, and turrets powered up to meet the incoming fleet. But the Resistance was ready. Coordinated squadrons of fighters engaged the Trivaxian ships, while larger vessels targeted the orbital platforms. Shadow 1, cloaked and agile, slipped past the main battle and headed for the planet's surface. Its mission was critical. Mark and his team would infiltrate the command facility and disable the planetary defense grid. Without that grid, the Resistance fleet could strike more freely, paving the way for a decisive victory. The team entered the atmosphere undetected, landing just outside the command facility. Using intelligence gathered from the Zalor 3 raid, they navigated through maintenance tunnels and hidden entry points. The facility was a fortress, but the Resistance had planned meticulously. They bypassed security checkpoints, neutralized guards quietly, and avoided triggering alarms. When they reached the central control chamber, the team split into 2 groups. Lila and her technicians worked to hack the defense grid, while Mark and the fighters secured the area. The Trivaxians quickly realized something was wrong, and reinforcements began to pour into the facility. The team held their ground, knowing that every second they delayed the enemy allowed Lila more time to complete her work. The fighting was intense. Mark's squad faced wave after wave of Trivaxian troops. Despite their advanced weaponry and armor, the Trivaxians struggled against the Resistance fighters' superior tactics and determination. The team used every tool at their disposal, stun grenades, improvised traps, and precise ambushes, to keep the enemy at bay. At last, Lila shouted over the comms. "It's done. The defense grid is offline." Mark gave the order to retreat. The team fought their way back through the facility, emerging just as Shadow 1 arrived to pick them up. The ship's cloaking device engaged as soon as they were aboard, hiding them from pursuing Trivaxian forces. In orbit, the Resistance fleet seized the opportunity. With the planetary defenses down, the Vanguard and other capital ships opened fire on key Trivaxian installations. Explosions lit up the surface as the Empire's stronghold crumbled. Resistance fighters cheered as one by one, Trivaxian warships retreated or were destroyed. By the end of the day, Drakkar Prime was in ruins. The Trivaxian High Command had either fled or been captured, and their ability to coordinate large-scale operations was shattered. For the first time in living memory, the galaxy saw the Trivaxian Empire brought to its knees. Mark stood on the bridge of Shadow 1, watching the aftermath unfold. The coalition fleet had won a decisive victory, but he knew the war wasn't over. The Trivaxians still had resources, and they would regroup. Yet this victory proved that unity and determination could overcome even the mightiest of oppressors. "We've shown them what we're capable of," Mark said, his voice calm but resolute. "Now, it's time to finish the fight." The victory at Drakkar Prime sent shockwaves through the galaxy. The once dominant Trivaxian Empire, which had held entire star systems under its thumb for generations, now found itself on the brink of collapse. Its fleets were fractured, its high command scattered, and its propaganda machine silenced. Rebellions erupted across the galaxy as more and more oppressed species rose up against their Trivaxian overlords. Humanity's resistance was no longer fighting alone, it had become the rallying point for a galactic revolution. Still, Mark knew the Trivaxians weren't finished. They were desperate, yes, but desperation often made an enemy more dangerous. Reports filtered in that the remaining Trivaxian forces were regrouping at their last major stronghold, Zelkara Station. Situated on the edge of the Empire's core territory, Zelkara was an enormous space station bristling with weapons, defended by a fleet of their most advanced warships. If the Resistance could take Zelkara, the Trivaxian Empire would be irreparably broken. The coalition leadership convened to plan the final assault. Mark stood alongside representatives from dozens of species, each of whom had suffered under the Trivaxians. Their differences no longer mattered, they all shared the same goal. The strategy was clear: the Resistance fleet would launch a massive, coordinated attack on Zelkara Station. At the same time, Mark and his infiltration team would slip aboard the station itself, disable its defenses, and capture the central command deck. Without their stronghold, the Trivaxians would have no choice but to surrender. Preparations for the assault took weeks. Ships were repaired and refitted, weapons stockpiled, and troops trained. The Resistance's forces had grown far beyond what anyone had thought possible a year ago. No longer a ragtag band of outcasts, they now wielded a fully operational fleet, including capital ships, bombers, and state-of-the-art stealth vessels. Even Shadow 1 underwent upgrades, receiving advanced cloaking enhancements and reinforced shielding. When the day of the assault finally arrived, the Resistance fleet emerged from hyperspace just outside Zelkara Station's defense perimeter. The station was a massive, ring-shaped structure that shimmered with layers of shielding and reflected the light of the distant star. Surrounding it were Trivaxian warships, sleek and deadly, with spires of weaponry bristling along their hulls. The Resistance's arrival was met with an immediate response. The Trivaxians scrambled to intercept the fleet, and the void was quickly filled with the flashes of weapons fire. Mark watched from the bridge of Shadow 1 as the battle unfolded. Resistance fighters darted between larger ships, their agility keeping them one step ahead of the Trivaxians' targeting systems. The Coalition's capital ships exchanged punishing volleys with Trivaxian dreadnoughts, the impact sending ripples of energy through the void. Zelkara Station itself began firing its massive rail cannons, each shot tearing through the ranks of the approaching fleet. It was clear that this would be no easy victory. As the fleet kept the Trivaxian ships occupied, Shadow 1 slipped through the chaos, its cloaking device rendering it invisible to the enemy. Mark and his infiltration team were ready. The plan was straightforward: they would dock at a maintenance airlock, move through the station's lower levels, and take control of the central command center. Lila and her tech crew would disable the station's main shields, allowing the Coalition fleet to launch a decisive strike against the core. Inside Zelkara, the team encountered immediate resistance. Trivaxian security forces were well prepared, having fortified every corridor and control room. The Resistance fighters moved swiftly, using their training and advanced equipment to gain the upper hand. They employed jamming devices to disrupt Trivaxian communications and stun grenades to disorient enemy squads. Mark's leadership kept the team focused, even as the fighting intensified. As they advanced, the team reached the station's shield control room. Lila and her tech crew went to work, bypassing layers of encryption and rerouting power systems to bring down the shields. The process was painstaking, but they knew that once the shields fell, the Coalition fleet could target Zelkara's critical systems. Meanwhile, Mark and the other fighters held off waves of Trivaxian reinforcements. Plasma fire scorched the walls, and the air was thick with the smell of burnt metal and ozone. When Lila finally brought the shields down, the Resistance fleet didn't hesitate. Outside the station, the Coalition's capital ships began their assault on Zelkara's exposed infrastructure. Bombers launched precise strikes, hitting weapons emplacements and power nodes. The Trivaxian fleet, now outmatched, started to falter. Some ships attempted to retreat, only to be pursued by Resistance fighters who had no intention of letting them escape. Inside the station, Mark's team pushed forward. Their objective was the central command deck, where the remaining Trivaxian leadership was directing the defense. The corridors grew narrower and more heavily defended as they approached. Automated turrets sprang to life, forcing the team to rely on their tech specialists to disable them. Mark led the charge, his sharp orders cutting through the chaos. Every step forward was hard-won, but the team never faltered. Finally, they breached the command deck. The room was a stark contrast to the rest of the station, sleek, polished, and dominated by a massive holographic display of the battle outside. Trivaxian officers and commanders turned in surprise as Mark and his team stormed in. A tense standoff ensued. The Trivaxian commander, a tall figure with a cold, calculating demeanor, stepped forward. His hand hovering near a console that could trigger the station's self-destruct sequence. Mark raised his weapon but didn't fire. Instead, he spoke, his voice firm, unwavering. He told the Trivaxians that their empire was finished. Their fleets were in shambles, their allies had abandoned them, and their people were rising up against their rule. If they detonated the station, it would only delay the inevitable. Surrender now, he said, and perhaps there would be a chance for the galaxy to rebuild. For a moment, there was silence. The Trivaxian commander's hand hesitated above the console. Around him, the other officers glanced nervously at one another. They could see the battle outside, hear the faint rumble of explosions growing closer. They knew Mark was right. After what felt like an eternity, the commander lowered his hand. "We will not detonate the station," the commander said, his voice strained. "You have made your point. The Trivaxian Empire will not survive this day." With that, the remaining Trivaxians surrendered. The Resistance secured the command deck, and Mark relayed the news to the Coalition fleet. The battle outside began to wane as the Trivaxian ships either retreated or stood down. The station, once a symbol of the Empire's unassailable might, was now under Resistance control. The aftermath was swift. The Coalition declared victory, and a provisional council was formed to begin the process of rebuilding the galaxy. Mark, though reluctant to step into a political role, was hailed as one of the heroes of the revolution. He knew that the work wasn't over, there would be power struggles, disagreements among the newly liberated species, and the long, difficult process of healing the wounds left by the Trivaxians' rule. But for the first time in generations, the galaxy had a chance to move forward. The Resistance had proven that even the mightiest oppressor could be brought low. It was a lesson etched in the hearts of every free being across the stars. And though the struggle had been long and brutal, it had led to a galaxy that could now begin to define itself not by fear, but by hope.